It is one of the great, celebrated legends of American history. A story of compassion on an industrial scale. Between 1854 and 1929, over 250,000 children were placed on trains in the bustling cities of the East Coast and sent into the heart of the American Midwest. They were called the orphan train riders. The official history paints a simple, noble picture. Unwanted, destitute, parentless children, rescued from a life of poverty and crime, and given a second chance in the wholesome farming communities of a growing nation. It is presented as a triumph of Christian charity, a monumental act of social good conceived by men like Charles Loring Brace and the Children's Aid Society. But what if the story we've been told is not just incomplete, but impossible? What if the very foundation of this narrative, the existence of 250,000 orphans in need of rescue, is a statistical mirage? The source cities, primarily New York, simply did not have the population, the birth rates, or the mortality rates to produce this many parentless children. The numbers do not add up. In this investigation, we will not offer unsubstantiated theories. We will present the numbers, the logistics, and the official documents themselves. We will examine the evidence that points not to a story of rescue, but to a silent, managed redistribution of a population that appeared from nowhere. The question is not where these children went. The question is where they came from. Our investigation begins with the images themselves. The photographs taken to document and promote the orphan train movement. They have become iconic, a visual shorthand for a bygone era of American struggle and resilience. We see children, lined up on train station platforms, gathered in small town squares, their faces a mixture of apprehension and hope. The official narrative uses these images to evoke pity. These are the street Arabs, the homeless urchins saved from the gutter. But look closer. Look past the caption and see what is actually there. In image after image, we do not see children ravaged by years of starvation and neglect. We see children who are, for the most part, clean. Their clothes, while perhaps simple, are often mended and presentable. They are not dressed in rags. Many appear adequately fed. Look at their faces. Do these look like children who have spent their lives fighting for survival on the streets? Or do they look like children who have come from some form of institutional care? There is an order here that contradicts the story of chaos. Observe their organization. They are grouped by age, standing in neat lines, posed for the camera with a kind of disciplined stillness. This is not a random assortment of runaways. This is a managed, curated group. The uniformity is unsettling. Why do so many photos show dozens of children all within a very narrow age range? It suggests a batch, a consignment. The language used at the time was placing out, a term borrowed not from charity, but from logistics and indentured servitude. It sounds cold, bureaucratic. It sounds like the distribution of assets. The sheer volume captured in these photographs is another anomaly. Photo after photo, train after train, year after year. A seemingly endless supply of children, appearing on platforms across the country. The visual record does not support the story of rescuing desperate individuals. It documents a steady, organized pipeline. A process. The children are posed with their chaperones, the agents of the aid societies. These agents appear stern, professional. They are not saviors in a moment of crisis. They are overseers managing a transfer. The bewildered expressions on the children's faces tell a different story than the one in the history books. It is not the look of sudden rescue. It is the look of profound dislocation, of being an item in a manifest, moved from one unknown location to another. The visual evidence, the very proof offered for the official story, is what first suggests that story is wrong. Beyond the unsettling visuals lies a deeper problem: the practical, logistical reality of what was being done. To move 250,000 children over 75 years is not a simple act of charity. It is a logistical operation on a scale that is difficult to comprehend, even with modern technology. Let's break it down. An average of over 3,300 children were transported every single year. That is more than 9 children per day, every day, for 3/4 of a century. Each child represented a complex chain of events. First, the child had to be identified. If they were a true orphan, both parents had to have died. Who confirmed this? Where were the death certificates? If they were abandoned, where was the police report? Then, the child had to be brought into the system. This means an intake process, medical examinations, and housing. The great institutions we associate with this movement, like the New York Foundling Hospital, had capacities. But were they large enough to process a constant flow of 9 new children every single day, on top of their existing population? The numbers suggest these institutions would need to be the size of small cities, with vast staffs of doctors, nurses, administrators, and caregivers. There is no record of such massive infrastructure. Then comes the transport itself. This required negotiating contracts with powerful railroad companies. It required scheduling, ticketing, and provisioning for journeys that could last for days. It required paying and managing the agents who chaperoned each group. These agents were responsible for dozens of children in a chaotic environment. Once they arrived in a small Midwestern town, another logistical challenge began. Advertisements had to be placed in newspapers in advance. A local committee of leading citizens had to be formed to vet potential families. The children would then be lined up on a stage at the local opera house or church, to be inspected like livestock. The official accounts present this as a simple, heartfelt process. But it describes a system of human distribution that is both highly organized and terrifyingly impersonal. How were these local committees vetted? How could a brief inspection determine the suitability of a home? Many children ended up in situations of abuse or were used as unpaid farm labor. The superficiality of the vetting process suggests its purpose was not child welfare, but placement efficiency. The goal was to empty the train. The entire operation, from intake in New York to placement in Nebraska, required a level of command, control, and communication that seems almost impossible for a collection of private charities in the 19th century. There was no internet, no telephone for much of this period. Coordination was done by mail and telegraph. Yet the pipeline flowed continuously. This wasn't a reactive system, responding to crises as they arose. It was a proactive, efficient, and relentless machine. A machine designed to move a product. The practical impossibility of this being a simple, benevolent enterprise forces us to ask a harder question. What if the machine was the purpose? What if the children were merely the raw material it was built to process? When a narrative contains profound logistical and visual contradictions, we must turn to the official sources themselves. We must examine the story as it was told by its creators. And what we find is not clarity, but a carefully constructed curtain of vagueness, moral justification, and missing information. The writings of the movement's founders, like Charles Loring Brace, are filled with sweeping generalizations. He speaks of the dangerous classes, of immigrant children running wild, of a city teeming with juvenile delinquents. He creates a moral panic. He paints a picture of a society on the brink of collapse, a problem so vast that only a drastic solution will suffice. This language is effective. It preemptively justifies the extreme measure of shipping children 1,000 miles away from their homes. It creates a powerful emotional argument that discourages logical questions. Who would dare argue against saving a child from a life of crime and squalor? But this moral framework is also a shield. It protects the operation from scrutiny. The records kept by the Children's Aid Society and other organizations are shockingly incomplete. For a project of this magnitude, one would expect meticulous files on each child. A history, a family tree, the circumstances of their entry into the system. Instead, the records are often a single ledger entry. A name, an age, and a destination. Many children were given new names. They were explicitly told to forget their past, to never speak of where they came from. Their birth certificates, if they ever existed, are often nowhere to be found. Why? If this was a transparent act of charity, why systematically erase the identity of the person you are claiming to save? The act of erasing a child's history is not an act of rescue. It is an act of control. It is the first step in creating a blank slate, a person with no connections, no inheritance, no story other than the one given to them by their new keepers. Furthermore, the explanations provided for the source of the children are always the same. It is a repeating template. They were the children of destitute Irish or German immigrants. Their parents died of consumption. They were found sleeping in doorways. These stories, while true in some individual cases, are repeated so often they become a mantra. A boilerplate explanation that serves to satisfy curiosity without providing actual data. It is a narrative that explains everything, and therefore explains nothing. The official story fails because it is not a history, it is a public relations campaign. It was designed in the 19th century to raise funds and gain public support. And it has been repeated by historians ever since, without ever truly questioning its fundamental premise. The story fails because it cannot account for the numbers, it cannot justify the logistics, and it cannot explain the systematic erasure of records and identities. It is a story that is falling apart. For a long time, the orphan trains were viewed as a uniquely American story. A response to the specific challenges of immigration and urbanization in the United States. But if we widen our lens, we see that this was not an isolated phenomenon. It was part of a larger, global pattern of child migration, managed by Western industrial powers during the exact same historical period. The most striking parallel is the British Home Children Scheme. Between 1869 and the 1930s, over 100,000 children were sent from Great Britain to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. The parallels to the American orphan trains are almost perfect. The program was run by philanthropic and religious organizations. The children were labeled as orphans or waifs, rescued from the poverty of industrial cities like London and Liverpool. The stated goal was to offer them a better life in the colonies. The reality was often a life of hard labor and abuse on isolated farms. The language is the same. The justifications are the same. The methods are the same. Mass transport on modern technology, in this case, steamships and trains. And most critically, the records are the same, sparse, incomplete, with identities often changed or completely erased. This was happening at the same time, for the same reasons, on the other side of the Atlantic. Is this a coincidence? Or does it point to a common, unspoken policy among industrializing nations? The pattern suggests a shared problem. That problem was a surplus of children who needed to be managed. Children whose existence, for one reason or another, was inconvenient to the state. The solution was a global distribution network. Charities and philanthropic organizations provided the perfect cover, lending a veneer of morality and benevolence to what was, in effect, a massive exercise in social engineering and labor trafficking. The children were moved from overcrowded urban centers, where they might become a source of social unrest, to colonial territories or rural frontiers, where labor was desperately needed. We can see smaller versions of this pattern elsewhere. Similar, though less organized, schemes existed to move children from cities in continental Europe. It was a standardized operating procedure for the 19th century industrial world. The existence of this global pattern fundamentally undermines the official story of the American orphan trains. It can no longer be seen as the benevolent project of a few New York-based reformers. It must be recontextualized as the American branch of a much larger, international system. A system designed to deal with a demographic anomaly that historians have yet to explain. The question is no longer just, where did 250,000 American children come from? The question is, where did the hundreds of thousands of children who filled these global pipelines come from? The problem is not American. It is systemic. This is the core of the problem. The one element that cannot be dismissed with appeals to charity or historical context. The numbers. The cold, hard logic of demographics. Let us perform a simple analysis. The orphan train movement began in 1854. In 1850, the population of New York City was approximately 515,000. Let's be extremely generous in our assumptions. Historical data suggests that in the 19th century, the rate of true orphans, children who had lost both parents, was significantly higher than today, perhaps around 1 to 2% of the total child population. Let's use an even higher, almost implausible number. Let's assume that 5% of all children in New York were true orphans. The number of children under 15 at the time was roughly 1/3 of the population, so about 170,000 children. 5% of that is 8,500 children. This is our absolute maximum pool of true orphans in the city at the start of the program. Yet, over the next 75 years, the trains would transport 250,000 children, many of them originating from New York. Remember the average: 3,300 children per year. How could a city with a starting pool of less than 9,000 orphans produce a surplus of 3,300 children for export, year after year after year? It is mathematically impossible. The numbers simply do not work. The official story attempts to bridge this gap by saying most were not true orphans, but half orphans or children from destitute families who gave them up. This raises even more difficult questions. We are asked to believe that thousands of families, particularly in tight-knit immigrant communities like the Irish and Italians, would voluntarily surrender their children to Protestant organizations they deeply distrusted, to be sent to unknown locations, never to be seen again. This defies everything we know about the social fabric of these communities. They had their own networks of support: the church, extended family, mutual aid societies. Surrendering a child was the absolute last resort, a mark of profound failure. Is it credible that this was happening 3,300 times a year? The numbers require a social collapse on a scale that is simply not reflected in any other historical record. There was poverty, yes. There was disease. But there was not a complete disintegration of the family unit on this level. The numbers tell us one thing with absolute clarity. The children on these trains could not have all come from the sources the official narrative provides. The pool of available orphans and destitute children was orders of magnitude smaller than the number of children who were actually transported. This is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of arithmetic. The input does not match the output. Therefore, there must be another input. A source of children that is not being mentioned in any official account. A hidden population, processed through this system and labeled orphan, as a matter of bureaucratic convenience. We are left with a series of impossible facts. The visual evidence contradicts the story. The logistics are staggering. The official records are a smokescreen. The pattern is global, and the numbers do not add up. Faced with these inconsistencies, we must construct a new hypothesis. Not a fantasy, but a controlled explanation that accounts for all the available evidence. The most logical, if unsettling, conclusion is this: the orphan train movement was not a charitable enterprise. It was the public-facing distribution arm of a much larger, unacknowledged system of population management. The term orphan was not a description of a child's family status. It was a legal and logistical category. A label applied to a child who had been separated from their source, stripped of their identity, and designated for redistribution. This label served a crucial purpose: it rendered the child powerless, without advocates, and legally available for placement. It made them inventory. If this is the case, where did the inventory come from? We cannot know for certain, because the system was designed to hide this information. But we can speculate on what kind of events would produce such a large, continuous surplus of undocumented children. Consider the existence of foundling homes and maternity hospitals that operated outside of official record-keeping. Institutions where young women could give birth in secret, leaving the children behind to be absorbed into a hidden system. This would create a steady stream of infants and young children with no legal identity. Consider the possibility of a systematic removal of children from populations deemed undesirable, not just the poor, but perhaps specific ethnic or social groups whose growth was seen as a threat. The narrative of saving them from squalor would provide the perfect ethical justification for what was, in reality, a targeted culling of a community. This hypothesis reframes the entire event. The problem being solved was not urban poverty. The problem being solved was the existence of a large population of children who needed to be disappeared from the cities and assimilated into the rural landscape. The goal was twofold. First, to clear the cities of this demographic surplus. Second, to supply a steady stream of cheap labor and new population to the expanding Midwest, binding those territories more closely to the Union. The charity organizations were not the architects of this system, but willing participants and managers. They provided the moral cover and the logistical framework. This hypothesis explains everything. It explains the military-style organization. It explains the erased records and changed names, a necessary step to prevent the children from ever tracing their origins. It explains the global parallels, as other industrial nations faced similar challenges of managing undocumented or unwanted populations. And most importantly, it explains the numbers. The system was not dependent on the random chance of parents dying. It was fed by a hidden, reliable source, which is why the pipeline could operate with such industrial efficiency for 75 years. The children were not being rescued. They were being processed. We have looked at the evidence. The photographs that tell a story of organization, not chaos. The logistical scale that dwarfs the capabilities of private charity. The official narrative, which raises more questions than it answers. The global pattern, which shows this was not a uniquely American event, but a standard operating procedure for the industrial world. And finally, the stark, inescapable mathematics. 250,000 children, appearing from a source that could not have possibly produced them. The official story of the orphan trains is a comforting one. It allows a nation to believe it has a history of compassion, of rescuing the unfortunate. But it is a story that does not withstand scrutiny. The evidence points in a different direction, toward a deliberate, systematic, and concealed operation of population management on a massive scale. It points to an event that has been scrubbed from the historical record, its true nature hidden behind a mask of benevolence. We are told to remember the orphan trains as a story of hope and second chances. But if the very foundation of the story is a mathematical impossibility, what are we actually remembering? What event have we been taught to celebrate, when we cannot even identify its source? The truth may be unsettling, but the inconsistencies are too profound to ignore. The records are out there. The census data is public. The photographs are in the archives. We encourage you to not take our word for it. Look for yourself. Examine the patterns. Run the numbers. And ask the simple, fundamental question that the official history has never answered. Where did they all come from? If you believe that historical inconsistencies like this deserve closer inspection, and that asking these questions is essential to understanding our present, consider subscribing for more investigations. The past is never truly past. It is merely waiting to be re-examined.